Hello, Rams, and welcome to yet another episode of Rams History. Now, today we'll talk about the fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. Before we get on to Napoleon's European adventures, let's take a brief side trip to the Western Hemisphere, and we'll talk a little bit about Napoleon there. Now, perhaps the most significant event regarding the Western Hemisphere has to deal with the slave rebellion in Haiti. Haiti had been a French possession, and there was a slave rebellion in 1791. Now, this slave rebellion eventually fails, but it does spark a new resistance led by Toussaint Louverture. He will then lead an army against the white masters in Haiti. Now, it coincides with history because the French Revolution will be taking place almost simultaneously. And the Revolution, of course, has this emphasis upon liberty, equality, and fraternity. So actually, in 1793, the French government abolishes slavery in Haiti, and Louverture is able to actually establish a republic with himself as its leader. Now, Napoleon, when he takes power, does not trust Louverture and actually sends an army to Haiti to attempt to crush him. Unfortunately for the French, the conditions in Haiti are quite difficult, and many of the French troops wind up dying of yellow fever. Now, Toussaint Louverture is eventually captured by the French, and he dies in prison. However, Napoleon very quickly begins to lose interest in his overseas empire. In fact, ladies and gentlemen, the impact for us in American history is that the troubles in Haiti, combined with Napoleon's need for money as his wars began to resume, results in Napoleon's decision to effectively get rid of France's overseas holdings. This makes the Louisiana Purchase possible and, of course, nearly doubles the size of the young United States. Now, Haiti remains today as an example of one of the few very successful slave rebellions in history. Now, Napoleon, of course, has designs on Europe, but one of the biggest obstacles to Napoleon will be the power of the British fleet. The Royal Navy ruled the waves. It was quite true then, and it would remain true all the way up until about World War II. Now, unfortunately for Napoleon, but very fortunately for the British Navy under the command of Admiral Lord Nelson defeats a French and Spanish fleet at a battle called Trafalgar in 1805. This effectively destroyed much of France's naval power, pretty much guaranteed that Britain was safe from invasion, and effectively meant that any of Napoleon's gains would have to be made upon land. A very clear example of how naval power benefited Britain. Because of naval power, Britain was able to remain a thorn in Napoleon's side throughout his career as Emperor of the French. On land, however, it was a bit of a different story. Napoleon had a number of advantages. First of all, he inherits the massive army left over from the French Revolution. You might recall we talked about the levée en masse, this mass army that was conscripted during the Revolutionary years. Because of that, Napoleon can put hundreds of thousands of men in the field at a single time, sometimes 700,000 men at a time. He has large numbers of troops, far more than any other power arrayed against him. And additionally, Napoleon is perhaps one of the greatest military geniuses of all time. His tactics and things were often far ahead of those of his opponents. So between Napoleon's skill and the massive number of troops at his disposal, Napoleon is able to really conquest or conquer most of Europe. His enemies greatly respected him. The Duke of Wellington once said that Napoleon's presence on the field was like having an additional 40,000 men. But Napoleon is effectively able to defeat the Austrians and take control of Italy. He then takes control of what was known as the Holy Roman Empire. In fact, Napoleon effectively kills the Holy Roman Empire. He consolidates it. It becomes known as the Confederation of the Rhine. He then goes on to defeat the Prussians. He will invade Spain, and then, of course, he will force the Russians to sign the Treaty of Tilsit, making peace with that nation. So by about 1810 or so, Napoleon has basically taken control of a good deal of Europe. Those parts of Europe that were not under his direct control were allied to him, and effectively only Great Britain remained as a potential opponent. So it does appear that Napoleon has been quite successful in spreading the revolution across Europe, and of course in effectively taking control of the European empire for him as well. Now, unfortunately for Napoleon, his conquests do not end his troubles. Although he has most of Europe now within his control, his actions will actually spark a pretty effective response. For example, nationalism begins to rise up, and people begin to oppose Napoleon in many ways. Now, one of the things Napoleon did do is he made the rule of Europe almost a family business. As this cartoon clearly shows, Napoleon was making up new kings and rulers as he went, and many of these new kings and rulers were relatives. For example, he put his stepson in control in Italy, and his brother Joseph was made king of Spain. Napoleon believed, I guess, that the only true people you could trust were family, and that is why he put many of his family members on the thrones across Europe. But in many of the occupied territories, this policy creates a great deal of resentment against Napoleon and France. Now, as we mentioned earlier, Great Britain controlled the seas, and Napoleon knew that effectively there was really no way for him to invade and conquer Britain. So what Napoleon tries to do is what, in his mind, is the next best thing. He knows that Great Britain is an island, and as such, Britain is heavily dependent upon trade. So Napoleon issues two decrees, the Berlin Decree of 1806 and the Milan Decree of 1807. And in those decrees, he attempts to basically cut off trade with Britain. All of the areas under his control in Europe were banned from trading. And Napoleon, of course, also attempted to ban neutral nations from trading with Britain, although with mixed success. The British responded in kind. As an aside, it was these policies that would eventually cause the United States to declare the War of 1812 with Britain. But unfortunately for Napoleon, his attempt at economic warfare is a failure. What Napoleon didn't realize is that Britain essentially has access to the rest of the world. Britain's naval power allows them to trade with India, with North America, South America. The British are able to get the imports and things that they need. Their economy did take a bit of a hit, but it was not fatal. On the other hand, the economies of Europe suffer badly because they do not have that same access to the rest of the world. And again, much like placing his relatives on thrones across Europe, this policy of economic warfare actually winds up hurting Europe more than Britain, and does, again, increase resentment against Napoleon. So the continental system largely does not achieve its goals. Now, Napoleon begins to make a series of blunders that will ultimately lead to his downfall. One of his greatest blunders, perhaps, was the invasion of Spain. Now, Spain had actually been a French ally, but beginning around 1807, Napoleon sends troops into Spain. He deposes the Spanish kings, who were actually a part of the Bourbon family. The Spanish Bourbons are deposed. He places his brother on the throne, and he believes that his military power will effectively enable him to control Spain. Unfortunately, what happens is the presence of the French begins to spark feelings of nationalism in Spain. And very quickly, the French troops in Spain are facing a nasty guerrilla war as Spanish nationalists basically began to deal with the French occupation. If you read about some of the fighting that took place during the Peninsular War, it sounds eerily similar to what Americans would face in Vietnam later on. Now, eventually, the British would actually land an army in Spain under the Duke of Wellington, and they would, of course, lend their assistance to the Spanish. And what happens for Napoleon is that Spain becomes almost an open sore. It starts to drain away a lot of his power. He has to send an awful lot of troops there to try to maintain his control, and it will help to weaken him. For the Spanish, though, this was a very traumatic experience, as this painting by Goya clearly represents. It shows Spanish civilians being gunned down by French troops. Now, the key word here to remember, ladies and gentlemen, is nationalism, because Napoleon's invasions began to spark these very powerful feelings all across Europe. Of course, I've already mentioned Spain, where the French invasion sparked a guerrilla war. In other places, though, too, nationalism begins to rise. Prussia. Napoleon had defeated the Prussians very effectively and had forced them to sign a treaty, effectively making them allies of Napoleon. But these strong feelings of Prussian nationalism began to rise, and eventually Prussia will break its treaty with France and will begin to go off its own way and become a belligerent again. But all over Europe, these feelings are beginning to rise, and they are feelings that will continue to be very powerful throughout the rest of the 19th century and on up to today. Now, Napoleon commits perhaps his greatest blunder with the invasion of Russia. Now, Russia had signed a treaty known as the Treaty of Tilsit with Napoleon, and for a time there was peace between the new nations, but it was always a very uneasy peace. Eventually, the Russians became very angry about certain actions Napoleon had taken regarding Poland and some other things. And so eventually Russia withdraws from the treaty and prepares to make war against Napoleon. Napoleon decides, I guess, he's going to preempt that, and he invades Russia in 1812. He took a massive army with him. The numbers vary, but most historians agree he took about 450,000 to 600,000 men with him. Now, the Russians actually follow a very wise policy. They effectively retreat before Napoleon. They offer battle only on limited occasions, and by the time Napoleon captures Moscow, it's nearing winter. The Russians actually burned Moscow. So when Napoleon arrives, he finds a barren capital with no resources whatsoever. By that point, it's about October. He's got no point or no further goal but to retreat. So as the Grand Army returns back toward France, it faces harsh weather, brutal conditions, starvation, disease, and all of these things take their toll upon the French army. This chart's in French, but I think you get the idea. It sort of shows the losses to Napoleon's forces over the course of the campaign. It has over 400,000 men crossing the Niemen River at the beginning of the campaign. They get to Moscow with about 100,000, and then the black line shows the retreat back. And during the retreat, notice the scale at the bottom relates to the temperatures, how brutally cold it was. By the time the remnants of Napoleon's forces crossed the Niemen River, there's only about 10,000 effective troops remaining. So for Napoleon and for the French army, the invasion of Russia is an absolute disaster. Now, this event has really in many ways fatally weakened Napoleon. His various opponents, the Austrians, the Prussians, the British, the Russians, they get together and they defeat him at a battle called Leipzig in 1813. Finally, in 1814, with the Allied forces occupying Paris, Napoleon is forced to abdicate. He gives up the throne and he is exiled to the Mediterranean island of Elba. Now, Napoleon does not intend to stay on Elba for very long. After being there for only about a year, he actually escapes from the island and he returns to France. This period becomes known as the 100 Days. Now, after his abdication, the Bourbons actually returned. The brother of Louis XVI, Louis XVIII, is placed upon the French throne as a constitutional monarch. Louis XVIII quickly retreats and escapes away from France. Napoleon resumes power. Now, on his return, Napoleon basically tells his enemies that he wants peace and that he will seek to give France a liberal constitution. But unfortunately, Napoleon's word by that point wasn't very good. His enemies do not believe his intentions, and so they prepare to go to war against him. The culmination of all of this, ladies and gentlemen, is the Waterloo campaign, June of 1815. Napoleon faces his opponent from Spain, the Duke of Wellington, and on the fields of Waterloo in Belgium, a British and Allied army basically withstands sledgehammer attacks by Napoleon's troops until the Prussians arrive and the combined British-Prussian army defeats the French. Napoleon's final battle is a loss. Napoleon is then forced to abdicate a second time. This time the British aren't taking any chances. He doesn't go to Elba. He's exiled to a tiny island in the Atlantic Ocean called St. Helena. Now, as Luke Skywalker once said, if there's a bright center to the universe, you're on the planet it's farthest from. I pretty much think that's how Napoleon must have felt on St. Helena. It's a tiny little speck in the Atlantic. Napoleon spends his remaining years on this island, effectively remembering the greatness that once was. And it is on the island of St. Helena that he will die in 1821 of what most people believe was stomach cancer, thus ending the career of one of the most remarkable individuals in European history. Well, ladies and gentlemen, I do hope you have enjoyed this quick look at the rise and fall of Napoleon Bonaparte. As always, if you like what you see here, please subscribe, and we'll see you again soon for another episode of Ram's History.